Clear prop.
Star 73, Yankee number 2, following twin traffic, 3 mile final, clear Pleasantville. 1 Charlie Bravo, exit in runway 25, going 4 mile final.
This is Behind the Prop with United Flight Systems owner and licensed pilot Bobby Doss and his co-host, Major Airline Captain and Designated Pilot Examiner Wally Mulhern. Now let's go Behind the Prop.
What's up, Wally?
Hey, Bobby, how are you?
Awesome. Today is another conversation around safety, emergencies, all these things. Recently in Houston, probably made national news. We had a jet go off of the runway at a fairly local large airport, GA Airport. No one was injured. Extremely lucky. I'm sure we'll hear more about it. Not going to talk about that incident today as much as we're just going to talk about really what should we as pilots be doing and thinking about to be safer and better about our job at hand of flying the aircraft. And you recently read an article, and we're going to tie all this stuff together and make a good show out of it. So talk a little bit about what the statistics are that you stumbled upon and what we're going to discuss today, Wally.
Yeah, what I wanted to talk about today is I'm not sure I'm going to say anything that is new, but this is I just happened to read the latest version of Plane and Pilot magazine came out, the November issue, and I was reading it, and there was an article in there which was a reprint of an article that was in Airfax Journal. Has to do with general aviation safety trends and what we should worry about. So I just started diving into it and looking at it, and one of the things that caught my eye was the pictures. I'm a picture kind of a guy, and I stumbled on I should say the graphics, because they were charts, they were pie charts, and it was talking about where the accidents happen, what phases of flight. Pilot error versus mechanical versus other things, and it's just a reminder of what the statistics tell us make airplanes crash. A lot of times on check rides, I will say to the applicant, what is the only way that we can guarantee that we will not be in an airplane crash today? And normally the applicant will go into, well, we'll do a thorough pre-flight, and we'll do this, and we'll check this, and we'll check this, and they go through this laundry list of things to do. And I said, okay, so if we do all that, does that guarantee that we will not be in an airplane crash today? And they'll say, well, no, but we could really check this and really do this, and we keep coming back to the same question. I say, does that guarantee that we will not be in an airplane crash today? And finally, the answer will come out, and they'll say, no, it doesn't guarantee us. And so I'll get back to the original question, and I'll say, well, what is the only way we can guarantee that we're not in an airplane crash today? And eventually, they will get to not fly, and that is really the only way. So we as pilots accept that we are taking a bit of a risk by getting in an airplane. I'm taking a risk by walking to the restroom and using the restroom. I could fall and crack my skull open on the floor and bleed to death, but it's an acceptable risk. So in life, we take risks all the time by getting on the highway and driving, or going into a restaurant and buying food from somebody who we don't know, and we put it in our body. I mean, there's a risk involved in that. So then we can go and we can look at the data, and again, these numbers don't really lie. We can go in and we can look at the data of what causes these accidents. And I think the telltale sign is, if you look at the numbers on this, 47.7% of general aviation accidents, and I believe this report was through 2018. I'm not exactly sure what the starting point of the numbers were, but it's about 3 years old. 47.7% of the accidents happened in the landing phase. So essentially half of the accidents were in the landing phase. 16.4% were in the takeoff and climb phase. So if you combine those, that's about 64%. So about 2/3 of the accidents were in the takeoff or landing phase. So I guess what I could say is, if you're going to go out and fly for an hour and you just want to practice to sharpen your skills, maybe the most bang for your buck would be to practice takeoffs and landings. And in last week's episode, we talked about takeoffs quite a bit. Well, that was the whole point of last week's episode. So 64% of the accidents are takeoffs and landings. That's very, very eye-opening to me. I mean, what do those have in common? Well, it's close to the ground. It is close to the ground, and impact with the ground is usually what ultimately causes airplanes to crash. That's what we're talking about here.
Yeah, and I think all of this also stems from something we talked about when we had Robert Sumwalt on about the null report, and that you can go kind of pivot on this data. It's something on the AOPA website. We'll make sure we put a link to that again in the show notes. But it's also shocking that, I guess I just in my own head still envision that it's VMC and the IMC conditions that causes a lot of this stuff. It's not where the accidents are happening. The large majority of accidents in the preliminary null report for 2021 says that 65% of the accidents are happening in day VMC conditions. Sorry, I take that back. 81% of them are happening in day VMC conditions for non-commercial fixed-wing aircraft, which is really what we're talking about on this podcast, right? Very, very few, only 11, again, early 2021 reports, only 11 total, 4.6%, happened during day IMC conditions. So I don't think we can be any better or more cognizant of what we're doing during the critical phases of flight, landing and takeoff. And while we would all think that it might be in bad weather or at nighttime, the data just doesn't show that. And we probably know we're all flying more during the daytime than we are at night. And that's when the accidents are happening, for sure.
Yeah, and if you look at weather-related accidents, and this is kind of shocking to me, it is 3.4% of the accidents. 3.4% are weather-related, and I believe that we can attribute that to the where we are technology-wise, from a standpoint of weather reporting, weather forecasting, weather display, being able to be displayed on your EFB on the flight deck, and the increase in the technology in the airplane that help with situational awareness. Sometimes we become a little bit too dependent on it, but I don't know. I don't know if we can prove this, but I believe that I think if you looked at general aviation accidents 25, 30 years ago, I would think that a lot more than 3.4% of them were weather related.
Oh, I would, yes, for sure. And you say it, but technology's there. A lot of these small GA jets have weather in the nose, right? I mean, the real-time radar in the nose or wing of the aircraft, which makes it very useful for pilots to be able to see what's right in front of them, right? And probably changes a lot of decisions that couldn't be made some 20, 30 years ago. We talked about landing and the takeoff phase quite a bit. The power plant is the big second one in this report that we were talking about today, and it's something we all practice and we all know that it's very likely that it's going to happen. It's not a matter of if, but more of a matter of when. If we're active pilots, that we're going to have an engine problem as we fly these GA single engine aircraft around. The advice there is just be ready, right? I think I have a number of instructors, chiefs on our team here. They've all experienced something. One of them has had 3 over his lifetime, and I think the advice he always gives everyone is that it's not a total loss. Everyone thinks they're going to have a complete loss of power, and you don't normally have a complete loss. Sure, I've seen the videos where the prop stops spinning, but he's told my team in safety meetings that it's more of a you lose 80% of the power. And so now that you got 20% left, how are you going to deal with that? How are you going to react to that scenario where you have some power, but you don't have enough to keep you aloft? Maybe just stretches you out a few hundred feet, right? That could be more disorientating for a pilot than a complete loss of power, right? So I guess think through those thought processes around full loss, mid loss, little loss, and be ready to make those decisions. I have fears of students flying planes on cross countries that maybe they have a rough running engine and they make the decision to put it down in a field when in actuality they just had an unbalanced engine and they could have kept flying for a great distance and been safe doing it. Because I know what I would do. I would be freaking out. It would have to be extremely scary to be at 2,000 feet and have an unbalanced engine that was shaking the plane, which would have to feel like it's falling apart, right, Wally? I mean, none of us are going to be enjoying that ride. We'll put it that way.
I think another piece of data that I extracted from this report was fuel management. It says that 8.3 of the accidents were caused by fuel mismanagement. Okay, and so we say, well, 8.3%. Okay, that's not a huge number, but if you take a look at that number, you can go in and say that 40% of those accidents were caused by fuel starvation and not fuel exhaustion. Well, what's the difference? Well, fuel exhaustion means there's no more fuel on the airplane. We're out of fuel, okay? Fuel starvation, it means that the engine quit because of a lack of fuel, but there was still fuel on board the airplane. And that's about as deep as the data goes. We can't go in and say, well, was it an airplane where you had to switch tanks, a Piper or Beechcraft, versus a Cessna where you just leave the fuel selector on both? Were they multi-engine airplanes and so forth? But 40% of the fuel problem, the crashes caused by fuel mismanagement, almost half of them, there was still fuel on board the airplane. And that really hit home. So, managing your fuel, making sure you're switching tanks at the appropriate time, is something that we just all need to be very aware of.
Wally, it's been a while. Why don't you go through the top 5 things that are very important to flying an aircraft again for our listeners?
One thing I bring up to people, especially on an instrument check ride, I'll say, okay, if here's your plan. Okay, you plan to go from airport A to airport B, and with ATC, you filed a routing and you filed an altitude. And that's kind of what you expect. You planned your whole flight around what you filed. Well, when you call clearance delivery, they may say, hey, we have a full route clearance for you, advise ready to copy. And you copy it down and it's totally different from what you expected. Different routing, a longer routing, different altitude. It just was not what you expect. So, what I like to say to people is there's 5 things that you need to consider at this point. And the first, number 1, is how does this affect my fuel? Okay. So is it, if it's longer, obviously it's probably going to take you longer, going to burn more fuel. Do you have enough fuel? Number 2 is you need to know, how is this going to affect my fuel? Number 3, how is this going to affect my fuel? Number 4, how is this going to affect my fuel?
Can I guess number 5? How's it going to affect your fuel?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We can fly. These airplanes will fly without electricity. They will. It may be extremely challenging, but it's not going to fall out of the sky. But these airplanes will not fly without fuel.
Yeah, it's been a while since you've had the opportunity to do that, so I want to make sure you had a chance to do that. Like Wally said, there's not a lot of new information here, but it is a staunch reminder of what we all need to be thinking about to try and prevent some of these incidents and accidents from happening. As we go from talking about where the majority of these accidents happen, the laundry list of the smaller incident counts are pretty similar, right? Mechanical gear or brakes, maybe a hard landing. But what is shocking as we move from the accidents themselves to which ones or where are the fatalities happening? Again, this being from the older, couple years old report, but still shocking that we just talked last week about takeoffs. We just had an incident recently with a takeoff here in town. No one got hurt, thank goodness. But the number one biggest number of fatalities was stalls during takeoff. And I've heard it. I've seen the YouTube videos. It's terrible. And I cringe when I think about people turning early. I know I've talked about it around the flight school. I live less than 3 miles from this airport, and I play golf at a golf course right at the end of the runway. And, of course, I see my tail numbers all the time in the air flying. And if I see someone turning 300 or 400 feet above the ground, I'm normally looking at the schedule to see who's in that aircraft, and I will ask them the question, what are you doing? You know, not during their flight, but follow-up. That's one of the points where I cringe, especially if they have any flaps, right? It's just not good flying. And it's not too difficult to stall an aircraft during takeoff. And we spent a lot of time on it last week, so I won't dwell on it. But the largest bar on the bar chart for fatalities is stall during flight. We just have to be ready and prepared for takeoff.
Right. Absolutely.
So the Null report, jumping back to that, and it's on the AOPA website, talking about the 2020 general aviation accidents. Pilot-related accidents are 66 or 10% of the accidents. I think there is this unknown column that we're going to learn a lot more about as the NTSB finishes their studies. But single-engine fixed-gear accidents, non-tail wheel, which is really what we do most of our flying in, 60%, multi-engine 6%, and still a big bucket of unknown. But lots and lots of accidents in the aircraft that we're probably all flying regularly now. And as you jump into the data on who's in the aircraft, it kind of does go by the numbers, meaning what are more of, but 323 of those accidents, more than a third of them are pilots with only a private pilot rating. And unfortunately, a third of the fatalities are there as well. Students make up a much smaller number. I was kind of surprised. I thought student pilots might be more of the accidents. It's only 6%. But there's quite a few accidents with an IFR pilot on board. There's more than there was with just private. So much like we've heard from the author of the Kelling Zone, Mr. Craig, saying that the 300-hour mark's probably where you're most susceptible to something happening. I think that makes sense based on this data that these IFR pilots and private pilots are being involved in these incidents and accidents, which is a shame. We could go on and on. Wally, anything to add before we wrap up the show?
No, when I give a private pilot check ride, the applicant will plan across country, and I give them far enough distances out to where they have to actually, it's just maybe not a nonstop flight. And so sometimes it's, they're going to, they're going to make a fuel stop, and it's their choice where they pick to make the fuel stop. And then we'll talk about why they picked the airport that they picked. Anyway, I gave a young man a cross country, and it was about a 600-mile flight. And the airplane he was using for the check ride was a Cessna 152, which with him and myself in there, we had some limitations as to how much fuel we could take. And when he presented the cross country to me, he had planned 7 fuel stops, and we didn't have a leg that was longer than 80 miles. That's a lot of up and down. His point was that he didn't want to land, his personal minimums to land with fuel was 2.5 hours worth of fuel. And I said, well, okay, all right, if that's what your minimums are, then that's what your minimums are. And we started talking about exposing ourselves to error and risk analysis. And I brought up the fact that the majority of the accidents are on takeoff and landing. So now we're exposing ourselves 7 times on this flight. Maybe we'd be better off to expose ourselves 4 times. It's a balance. It's a balance, because to do that, now he would have to land with less than 2.5 hours worth of fuel, which is his personal minimums. And I'm not saying either way, because it's just your opinion on how you want to handle this. But it's just something to think about. It's something to think about. Sometimes the perceived most conservative way of doing something may not be the safest way of doing it.
No, I agree with that. And that sounds like a lot of stops. And as a commercial pilot, I mean, you're kind of more being asked to get your passengers and payload there, right? So I don't think a passenger is going to want to land 7 times either for a flight that could be maybe a 2-stopper instead of a 7-stopper.
And another analogy I use is driving down a major highway. I think statistically we could prove that driving 20 miles an hour, if you're the only one on the road, driving 20 miles an hour is probably statistically safer than driving 65. If you were to have a blowout at 20 miles an hour, the chances of being able to control the vehicle a lot better than at 65. But if you do it in Houston traffic, you're a hazard. So
yeah, no question.
So in that case, the most conservative is not the safest.
Yeah, so that's maybe a good way to wrap up the show. Conservative might not always be the safest and might not always keep you off these reports. So as we discussed, plan, be prepared, and make good decisions for both you, the aircraft, your passengers, everyone involved. We want to see everybody keep flying out there. So with that, we'll wrap up the show. As always, fly safe and stay behind the prop.
Thanks for checking out the Behind the Prop podcast. Be sure to click subscribe and check us out online at BehindTheProp.com. Behind the Prop is recorded in Houston, Texas. Creator and host is Bobby Doss. Co-host is Wally Mulhern. The show is for entertainment purposes only and is not meant to replace actual flight instruction. Thanks for listening, and remember, fly safe.